There's a Vanderbilt mansion that still stands today. Not as a museum, not as a hotel or university or repurposed landmark. Just standing, locked, silent, untouched for decades. No tours. No visitors. No explanations. The gates are closed. The windows are dark. And the family has never publicly explained why. In the Gilded Age, the Vanderbilt name meant power without apology. Their mansions dominated landscapes, rewrote city skylines, and made absolutely clear who controlled American wealth. Most of those estates are famous now, preserved as museums, celebrated as architectural triumphs, open to millions of visitors who marvel at the scale of Gilded Age excess. The Breakers in Newport. Biltmore in North Carolina. Marble House overlooking the Atlantic. All Vanderbilt. All preserved. All remembered. But this mansion is different. It's not abandoned. Abandoned buildings decay, attract squatters, fall into romantic ruin. This one is maintained. It's not destroyed. Demolished mansions leave traces, foundations, historical records of why they were removed. This one is intact. It's simply closed. Deliberately. Permanently. Without explanation. The doors were locked sometime in the mid-20th century. And they've never been opened again. Staff were dismissed. Events stopped happening. Society invitations ceased. The mansion that once hosted senators and industrialists, that functioned as a center of American power, that was built to last forever, simply withdrew from the world. No announcement. No scandal that forced closure. No financial collapse that required sale. Just silence. And that silence has lasted so long that even asking about the mansion feels inappropriate, like violating an unspoken agreement that some things are not meant to be discussed. Tonight, we reveal the story behind the Vanderbilt mansion that was quietly locked forever. The story of a house built to Project Permanence that became a liability when permanence was no longer something the family wanted to project. The story of a dynasty that realized the most powerful move wasn't preserving their monument, but making sure no one could ever see inside it again. This is not a story about abandonment. This is a story about control and what powerful families do when their symbols of dominance become evidence of something they need to hide. This is the story of the mansion that was locked to keep a story from getting out. And it begins with a family who believed their power would last forever. The Vanderbilt dynasty is at the absolute peak of American power. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore, has been dead for 6 years, but the empire he built is stronger than ever. His railroads control transportation across the eastern United States. His investments have made the family wealthier than most small nations. His descendants have taken that fortune and transformed it into something even more valuable: social legitimacy. Because the Commodore was new money, brutal, ruthless, unrefined. But his children and grandchildren have spent decades converting wealth into something more permanent: dynasty. They've married into old money families. They've commissioned mansions from the finest architects. They've collected art, funded universities, hosted the kind of social events that determine who matters in American society. And in 1883, one branch of the family decides to build something that will cement their permanence forever. A mansion scaled not for a lifetime, but for generations. The location is chosen carefully. Prominent enough to be seen, exclusive enough to signal status, positioned to anchor the family's presence for centuries to come. The architect is given instructions that reflect absolute confidence in the dynasty's future. Build for permanence. Design for expansion. Assume the family will occupy this house for as long as America exists. Construction begins in 1884 and takes 4 years to complete. The scale is staggering, not quite as massive as Biltmore, which will come later, but substantial enough to overwhelm anyone who approaches. 60 rooms spread across 3 floors. A ballroom designed to hold 300 guests. Dining rooms that seat 50. Libraries filled with books chosen for their bindings rather than their content. Reception halls large enough to make visitors feel appropriately small before they even meet the family. The materials are imported: marble from Italy, stone from France, woodwork from Germany, fabrics from England. The craftsmanship is European. Artisans brought across the Atlantic specifically for this project, working to standards that American workers haven't yet mastered. The cost is substantial, several $1,000,000, a fortune that would be nearly impossible to justify by any practical measure. But practicality isn't the point. The mansion is designed to send a message. The Vanderbilts are permanent. Not just wealthy, permanence and wealth are different things. Plenty of families have money. Few have the kind of rooted, multi-generational stability that allows them to build something like this. The mansion is completed in 1888, and for the first 2 decades, it functions exactly as intended. Society events are held regularly: spring galas, summer garden parties, autumn dinners, winter balls. The guest lists read like a directory of American power: senators, governors, industrialists, bankers, the carefully curated elite whose approval determines social standing. Political conversations happen in the library, over brandy. Business deals are negotiated in the smoking room. Marriages are arranged during carefully choreographed dinners where eligible heirs are strategically seated near appropriate families. The mansion isn't just a house, it's a machine for consolidating power, managing social capital, and ensuring the Vanderbilt name remains central to American influence. And it works. For 20 years, the mansion serves its purpose flawlessly. The family who occupies it, we'll call them the branch, to distinguish them from the better-known Vanderbilt lines, establishes themselves as exactly what they intended: a permanent fixture of American high society. Their children are invited to the right social clubs. Their opinions are sought on cultural matters. Their presence at an event legitimizes it. They've achieved what wealth alone can never buy: the assumption of permanence. The belief that families like theirs simply are, they don't need to prove themselves, they don't need to justify their position, they just exist as part of the natural order of things. But while the mansion projects confidence, subtle signs of fragility are already visible to anyone paying attention. The branch's fortune, while substantial, isn't growing the way earlier Vanderbilt wealth did. The railroad monopolies that created the family's original power are being challenged by antitrust legislation. Investments made by the previous generation are performing adequately, but not spectacularly. And the current generation, the ones actually occupying the mansion, are discovering something their grandparents didn't have to face. Maintaining a dynasty is harder than building one. Because building requires vision, ruthlessness, and the kind of focused ambition that comes naturally when you're escaping poverty. But maintaining requires something more subtle: the ability to adapt, to evolve, to recognize when the conditions that enabled your rise have changed. And the branch, like many Vanderbilt descendants, are better at performance than adaptation. They know how to host perfect dinners. They understand the rituals of social dominance. They can maintain the appearance of permanence. But appearances aren't the same as reality. By 1910, cracks are starting to show, not in the mansion, which remains flawlessly maintained, but in the family itself. The patriarch of the branch, the man who commissioned the house, is aging without a clear succession plan. His sons disagree on how to manage the family's investments. His daughters have married into families whose own fortunes are declining. The unified dynasty the mansion was built to house is quietly fragmenting. And more troubling than internal fractures is external change. America is shifting. The progressive movement is challenging the legitimacy of inherited wealth. Journalists are exposing the brutal methods that built Gilded Age fortunes. The public is beginning to question whether families like the Vanderbilts deserve their power, or whether that power is simply historical theft dressed up in marble and chandeliers. The mansion that was built to Project Permanence is starting to feel like evidence, not of stability, but of excess. Not of legitimacy, but of inequality. The branch doesn't see this clearly yet. They're still hosting events, still performing the rituals of dynasty, still believing that as long as the mansion stands and the parties continue, their position is secure. But outside the walls, the world that allowed families like theirs to dominate without question is beginning to disappear. And the mansion, perfect, permanent, built for forever, is about to become the very thing it was designed to prevent: a liability. The world has changed more in the past decade than it did in the previous 50 years. World War I shattered the illusion that the old social order was inevitable or natural. Millions died, proving that dynasties and aristocracies and the families who claimed divine right to rule could bleed and fail just like anyone else. In Europe, monarchies collapsed. In Russia, the Romanovs were executed. In America, the Vanderbilts didn't face revolution, but they faced something almost as destabilizing: irrelevance. The Branch's mansion is still standing, still maintained, still hosting occasional events. But the nature of those events has changed. Where once senators came to negotiate legislation, now they send polite regrets. Where once industrial titans gathered to form monopolies, now they meet in corporate boardrooms, because antitrust legislation has made the old backroom dealing more risky than valuable. Where once high society gathered because a Vanderbilt invitation meant something, now they come out of habit or obligation, not genuine respect for the family's power. The Branch can still fill the ballroom, barely. But they can't fill it with people who actually matter anymore. Because mattering has changed. In the Gilded Age, social acceptance from families like the Vanderbilts could make or break careers. But by the 1920s, success increasingly comes from different sources: business innovation, political populism, celebrity, new forms of wealth that don't require old money approval. The Branch's power, the kind that came from controlling access to legitimacy, is eroding. And the mansion, which was supposed to project permanence, is instead becoming a symbol of anachronism. It's too large for modern living, too expensive to maintain without the kind of growing wealth the family no longer has, too tied to a version of America that's disappearing. By 1925, the financial reality is undeniable. The Branch's fortune, which seemed inexhaustible when the mansion was built, is now merely substantial. Enough to live comfortably. Not enough to maintain a 60-room palace designed for a dynasty that no longer functions as one. The costs are staggering: property taxes, staff salaries, maintenance, heating, repairs, insurance. Tens of thousands per year just to keep the house functioning. Money that produces no return, serves no purpose beyond maintaining an appearance that fewer people care about each year. The family convenes to discuss options. Sell the mansion? Unthinkable. That would be admitting defeat, surrendering the symbol of their permanence, confessing that they're no longer the family they built the house to prove they were. Open it to the public as a museum? Worse. That would mean allowing strangers to walk through their private spaces, to judge their taste, to see the mansion not as a living dynasty, but as a historical artifact. It would be like attending your own funeral. Subdivided into apartments? Absolutely not. The humiliation of turning a Vanderbilt mansion into middle-class housing would be worse than demolition. So they choose the only option that preserves both the mansion and their dignity. They simply stop using it. Not officially. Not publicly. They don't announce closure or issue statements. They just gradually reduce the house's role in their lives. Events become less frequent. 1925, 6 major gatherings. 1926, 4. 1927, 2. 1928, 1 awkward dinner that everyone attends out of obligation but no one enjoys. 1929, nothing. The staff is reduced quietly. Not fired all at once. That would create talk, raise questions. Just attrition. When someone retires or leaves, they're not replaced. The household that once required 30 people to operate is down to 15, then 10, then 5. Eventually, just a skeleton crew maintaining the building itself, not for occupancy but for preservation. Entire wings of the mansion are closed off. Furniture covered with sheets. Fires no longer laid in rooms. No one enters. The ballroom, designed for 300, sits empty. The dining room, scaled for 50, gathers dust. The bedrooms, perfectly appointed, remain pristine and unslept in. By 1935, the mansion is barely functioning as a residence. The family still technically owns it. They still pay the taxes and maintenance costs. But they've moved their actual lives elsewhere, to smaller, more manageable properties that don't require explaining. And crucially, no one outside the family really notices. Because by the 1930s, society has moved on. The Depression has rearranged American priorities. People are more concerned with survival than social hierarchies. The families who once cared desperately about Vanderbilt approval are either bankrupt or adapting to new realities. The mansion's absence from social life is noted by no one, because social life itself has been fundamentally transformed. But the branch faces a new problem. The mansion still stands. It's not generating income. It's not serving any function. But it's costing money and, more importantly, it's a visible symbol of excess in an era when excess has become shameful rather than enviable. During the Depression, enormous private estates start to feel obscene. Families that flaunt wealth while others starve face increasing public hostility. The mansion, which was supposed to announce permanence, is now announcing something else entirely: inequality. Waste. The arrogance of a class that built palaces while working people died in their factories. The branch doesn't want that attention. They don't want journalists investigating their wealth. They don't want political movements using their mansion as an example of what's wrong with American capitalism. They don't want the house that was supposed to cement their legacy becoming evidence against them. So they make a decision. Not to demolish it. That would create more attention than the mansion currently receives. Not to sell it. That would mean losing control of the narrative, potentially seeing their palace turned into something that would humiliate them further. But to lock it. Quietly. Permanently. Without explanation. The remaining staff are dismissed with generous severance and instructions to never discuss their employment. The gates are locked. The utilities are maintained at minimal levels, enough to prevent decay, not enough for occupancy. Security is hired, not to protect against break-ins, but to ensure no one can see inside. And the family simply stops talking about it. They don't announce the closure. They don't respond to inquiries. When asked about the mansion at social gatherings, which happens less and less as time passes, they offer vague responses. We're considering various options for the property. It's being preserved for future generations. Family matters regarding the estate are private, and because they're still Vanderbilts, because old money families are granted the courtesy of privacy, because no one quite knows how to press further without being rude, the questions stop. The mansion falls out of conversation. And within a decade, it's as if the house never existed, still physically present, but socially vanished. This is old money's greatest skill, the ability to disappear in plain sight. Not through drama or scandal or spectacular collapse, but through quiet withdrawal, strategic silence, and the understanding that sometimes the most powerful move is refusing to explain yourself. The mansion was locked to preserve control. Not control of the building, that was never really the point. Control of the story. Because as long as the mansion remains locked, as long as no one can access it, as long as the family refuses to discuss it, no one can define what it means except them. And they've chosen to let it mean nothing. To let it fade into silence. To let it become a question no one remembers to ask. The exact date the mansion was permanently locked has never been publicly recorded. There was no ceremony. No final event. No last gathering of family and friends to bid farewell to a house that had defined their dynasty. Just a day, sometime in the late 1930s or early 1940s, records are deliberately vague, when the last staff member left, the last door was locked, and the mansion entered a state it has never left. Sealed. Preserved. Inaccessible. The final weeks before closure were handled with the precision of a military operation. Not because the logistics were complex, closing a house is straightforward, but because the family understood that how they closed it would determine what story was told about why. Everything that could create narrative was removed or controlled. Personal documents were taken to secure storage, not destroyed, but removed from the premises where they might someday be found by historians or journalists. Valuable art and furniture were quietly relocated to other family properties or placed in secure storage facilities under corporate names that couldn't be traced directly to the Vanderbilts. Anything that could be photographed, cataloged, or used as evidence of how the family actually lived was systematically eliminated. What remained was curated. The mansion wasn't stripped. That would look like desperation. Instead, it was arranged. Furniture was positioned in rooms as if the family had just stepped out and might return at any moment. Books were left on tables, open to specific pages that suggested cultivation and refinement. Decorative objects were placed with a kind of casual perfection that only comes from deliberate staging. The house was frozen not as it actually was when occupied, but as the family wanted it to be remembered if anyone ever saw inside. The staff who performed this work were required to sign agreements, not formal legal contracts, which might someday become public records, but gentlemen's agreements backed by the understanding that violating Vanderbilt confidence would destroy any future employment prospects. Most honored those agreements. A few, late in life, spoke carefully to family members or local historians, but always off the record, always without specifics, always with the caveat that they'd been sworn to secrecy. One housekeeper, interviewed in the 1970s when she was in her 80s, described the final days. "We were told the family was transitioning the property. That's the word they used, transitioning. Not closing, not abandoning. Transitioning. As if it were temporary. As if they'd come back. But we knew. The way they had us arrange everything, the way they removed certain things but left others, it felt like preparing a stage. Not for living. For memory." The physical locking itself was handled by a private security company hired specifically for the task. Not local contractors who might talk. Not staff who might have emotional attachments. Professional strangers who understood they were being paid for discretion as much as labor. Every door was checked and locked. Every window was secured. The main gates were chained with locks that required multiple keys, none of which were left with anyone locally. Security was established. Not guards living on premises, which would draw attention, but regular patrols by a firm whose other clients included government buildings and corporate headquarters. Their instructions were simple: ensure no one enters, document any attempted intrusions, report to family lawyers rather than local authorities. And then it was done. The mansion that had taken 4 years to build, that had functioned as a center of power for 40 years, that had cost millions to construct and maintain, was simply removed from active existence. The family's relationship with the property became purely administrative. Taxes paid through a trust. Maintenance contracted to companies who worked without ever meeting anyone from the family. Security reports reviewed by lawyers who had never visited the premises. The mansion became a line item on financial statements rather than a living part of the dynasty. But here's what made this closure different from abandonment. The house was maintained. Not lavishly. The days of fresh flowers and weekly cleaning were over. But structurally. The roof was repaired when necessary. The heating system was kept functional at minimal levels to prevent damage from humidity and cold. Pest control was regular and thorough. The mansion wasn't being allowed to decay. It was being preserved, not as a home and not as a museum, but as something stranger. A sealed memory. A physical object kept intact but removed from context. A monument maintained not for public viewing but for what? That question has never been adequately answered. Because the family won't discuss it. And the mansion remains too well secured for anyone to investigate independently. Local historians occasionally speculate about what's inside. Some believe the house contains art and furniture worth millions, though if so, why not sell it? Others think there are documents or personal papers that would reveal embarrassing family secrets, though after nearly a century, what secrets could still matter? A few imagine the mansion is simply empty, stripped of everything valuable, maintained out of stubborn pride rather than any practical purpose. But without access, all anyone has is speculation. And speculation, without evidence, eventually fades into silence. By the 1950s, most people in the area had accepted the mansion's locked status as simply how things were. The estate was marked on maps but not discussed. Children growing up nearby knew it existed but learned not to ask about it. Real estate agents showed properties in the vicinity but never mentioned the Vanderbilt mansion, not because they were told to avoid it, but because bringing it up felt somehow inappropriate. The house had achieved a kind of social invisibility. Present but not acknowledged. Visible but not seen. Existing in a category beyond abandonment or preservation. Something for which there wasn't quite a word. And the family, from whatever distance they maintained, seemed content with this arrangement. They paid the taxes. They kept the security. They ensured the structure remained intact. But they never explained why, never offered tours, never donated it to historical societies or opened it for research, never even acknowledged, in any official capacity, that the house had been deliberately closed rather than simply unused. The silence became so complete that even asking about the mansion felt like violating something, not a rule, exactly, but an understanding. That some things are private. That some family decisions are not subject to public scrutiny. That old money, when it chooses to withdraw, does so on its own terms. And those terms included never explaining what happened inside the mansion that required it to be locked forever. One local historian, researching Vanderbilt properties in the 1990s, attempted to file a request for access under historical preservation laws. The response came not from the family, but from lawyers representing the estate trust. It was polite, firm, and absolutely final. The property remains private. Access will not be granted for research, documentation, or any other purpose. This decision is not subject to negotiation or public review. The historian pressed further, arguing for the public interest in understanding Gilded Age architecture. The lawyers responded with a reminder that private property remains private regardless of historical significance. The historian eventually abandoned the project, because that's what the locked mansion does. It makes people give up, not through hostility or confrontation, but through sheer, impenetrable silence. The doors were locked decades ago, and they've never opened since. There are dozens of comprehensive books about Vanderbilt mansions. The Breakers has entire volumes dedicated to its architecture, its social history, the family dramas that played out within its walls. Biltmore is one of the most documented private estates in American history, floor plans available, room-by-room descriptions published, every detail of its construction cataloged. Even the demolished Vanderbilt mansions have extensive historical records, photographs, architectural drawings, society page mentions, descriptions of the events held there. But this mansion, the one that's still standing, still intact, still maintained, appears in exactly one paragraph in most Vanderbilt histories. Sometimes less. Sometimes not at all. It's not censored. It's not officially secret. It's simply not discussed. And the reasons for that silence reveal more about power than any dramatic scandal ever could. Because the mansion's obscurity isn't accidental. It's cultivated. The first layer of silence is legal. The property is held in a complex trust structure, the kind that old money families have perfected over generations. Not owned by individuals who can be identified and contacted. Owned by legal entities that exist solely to hold assets. Managed by firms that specialize in privacy. Controlled by trustees who have legal obligations to maintain confidentiality. Any attempt to research the property through public records hits immediate walls. The trust's formation documents are sealed. The tax records are filed under corporate names that reveal nothing. The maintenance contracts are with companies that won't discuss clients. Even the security firm that patrols the grounds operates under non-disclosure agreements that survive longer than most family memories. This isn't paranoia. It's infrastructure. The kind of systematic privacy that requires wealth, expertise, and generational commitment. Most families couldn't maintain this level of silence. But the Vanderbilts aren't most families. They've had over a century of practice at controlling narratives. The second layer of silence is social. Old money has unwritten rules about what can and cannot be discussed publicly. Other prominent families know about the locked mansion. They move in the same circles, they attend the same events, they understand the geography of inherited wealth. But they don't talk about it. Not because they're forbidden, but because discussing another family's private choices, especially choices that involve withdrawing from visibility, is simply not done. It's considered vulgar, invasive, the kind of behavior that marks you as new money, as someone who doesn't understand how old families operate. One society figure, speaking privately, explained it this way. Everyone knows about the house. Everyone knows it's locked. Everyone knows the family doesn't discuss it. And, because we know they don't discuss it, we don't ask. That's how it works. Privacy isn't granted because you demand it, it's granted because people respect the boundaries you establish. And the Vanderbilts established that boundary very clearly. This social silence is perhaps more powerful than legal silence, because legal barriers can be challenged. But social agreements maintained across generations of families who've known each other for over a century, those are nearly impenetrable. The third layer of silence is practical. Journalists who've investigated the mansion have found that there's simply no story they can publish. No access to photograph the interior. No family members willing to comment. No staff who'll talk on the record. No documents that explain why it was locked. You can't write an article that's entirely speculation and unnamed sources. Or rather, you can, but no respectable publication will run it. And without publication, the story doesn't enter the historical record. A few local newspapers have published brief pieces over the decades. The mystery of the locked Vanderbilt mansion, or what happened to the Branch estate? But these articles always hit the same wall. They can confirm the mansion exists. They can verify it's locked. They can note that the family won't discuss it. And then they have nowhere to go. Because mystery without resolution doesn't sustain interest. Readers want answers. When there aren't any, the story dies. The fourth layer of silence is historical. Academic historians face a particular problem with the mansion. Without access to primary sources, they can't make authoritative claims. And historians hate making claims they can't support with documentation. Some have tried approaching the property from different angles. Architectural history, blocked by inability to survey the building. Social history, blocked by lack of records about events held there. Economic history, blocked by the trust structure hiding financial details. Family history, blocked by descendants who won't participate in research. Every approach leads to the same dead end. Eventually, historians do what they always do when sources are inadequate. They move on to topics they can actually research. The mansion becomes a footnote. Another Vanderbilt property, now closed to research, exists but cannot be adequately documented. And footnotes don't generate interest. They just acknowledge gaps in knowledge. Which is exactly what the family wants. The fifth layer of silence is temporal. With each passing decade, fewer people remember when the mansion was active. The generation that attended events there is dead. Their children, who heard stories, are dying. The grandchildren have vague family legends about the old estate, but no direct memories. By now, multiple generations have grown up with the mansion already locked. For them, its closure isn't a mystery, it's just a fact. Like saying, the Vanderbilt's own property that isn't open to the public. That's not surprising. Most wealthy families have private property. The strangeness of it, the deliberateness of the closure, the systematic silence, the fact that it's been locked for nearly a century, only registers if you remember when it was different. And those people are gone. Time, more than any legal structure or social agreement, is the ultimate guardian of silence. Because you can't ask questions about something you don't know exists. And increasingly, people don't know. The mansion is disappearing from collective memory, not through demolition, through obscurity. A local librarian who maintains the historical archives for the region noticed this pattern. People used to come in asking about the Vanderbilt mansion. Not often, but maybe once every few months, journalists, historians, curious locals. But the last inquiry was 3 years ago. Before that, 5 years. People are forgetting there's anything to ask about. Another generation, and I don't think anyone will even remember the house was ever socially significant. This is exactly what the family achieved. Not dramatic erasure, but gradual, inevitable forgetting. The mansion still stands. But its story is dying. And when a building's story dies, the building itself becomes just stone and wood, architecture without meaning, presence without context. Which raises the question that haunts anyone who learns about the locked mansion. What are they hiding? Because this level of silence, maintained this systematically for this long, it suggests something more than mere privacy. It suggests protection. But protection of what? The most common theories involve scandal, an affair, a crime, a family's secret so damaging that even a century later it requires containment. But that seems unlikely. Scandals fade. People die. Eventually, Even the most embarrassing family secrets become historical curiosities rather than active threats. Unless what's being protected isn't scandal, but something more subtle and more damaging to the family's self-image. The mansion represents a moment when the Vanderbilt dynasty believed in its own permanence. When they built as if they would last forever. When they assumed their power was natural, inevitable, eternal. And then it wasn't. The dynasty fractured. The power faded. The assumptions proved false. The mansion stands as evidence of that miscalculation, of hubris, of the gap between what the family believed they were and what they actually became. And perhaps that's what requires eternal silence. Not scandal, not crime, just the architectural proof that even the mighty Vanderbilts could be wrong about their own future. The mansion was locked to preserve privacy, but the silence around it preserves something more valuable. The illusion that old money never fails, it just gracefully withdraws. The mansion exists today in a strange limbo. Legally, it's private property, owned, maintained, secured. Socially, it's a non-entity, present but not acknowledged, visible but not seen. Historically, it's a gap, a space where a story should be but isn't. And that absence has become its own kind of presence. Because humans are pattern-seeking creatures. We need narratives to make sense of the world. And when we encounter something that deliberately resists narrative, something that exists but won't explain itself, it creates a particular kind of cognitive discomfort. The locked mansion is that discomfort made physical. People who learn about it can't quite let it go. Not because it's dramatic or scandalous, but because it's incomplete. And incomplete stories haunt us more than finished ones. There's a small community of people, researchers, local historians, architecture enthusiasts, who've become quietly obsessed with the mansion. Not in a conspiratorial way. Just in the way people become fixated on puzzles that don't have solutions. They trade theories online. They share the few photographs that exist, all exterior shots, nothing revealing. They analyze property records, looking for clues in the truss structure. They map the estate's boundaries and note how security has evolved over decades. But they all hit the same wall, the family's systematic, impenetrable silence. One researcher, who's spent 15 years trying to document the mansion, described the experience. It's like trying to photograph a black hole. You can see the effects, the property exists, the security is real, the taxes get paid. But you can't see the thing itself. And every attempt to get closer just confirms how effectively it's been removed from accessible history. After a while, you realize that's the point. The mansion isn't hidden despite being visible, it's hidden because it's visible. Everyone knows it's there, so no one questions why they can't see inside. This realization, that the mansion's obscurity is maintained through presence rather than absence, reveals something profound about how old money operates. Because old money doesn't hide by disappearing. It hides by existing so quietly, so unremarkably, that hiding becomes invisible. The mansion is locked. Everyone knows it's locked. But because it's not falling apart, not causing problems, not doing anything dramatic, the locked status becomes normalized. Just another private property that happens to belong to a prominent family. Nothing to see here. Nothing to question. And that normalization is perhaps the family's greatest achievement. Not building the mansion, plenty of wealthy families built mansions. Not locking it, that's just a practical decision. But making the locked status so unremarkable that most people don't even register it as strange. That's power operating at its most refined level. Today, the land where the mansion stands is worth millions. Prime real estate that could be developed, sold, repurposed. The building itself, if opened, could be a museum generating revenue, a hotel commanding premium rates, a venue for events. But none of that will happen. Because the family has chosen something more valuable than money. Control of narrative. As long as the mansion remains locked, as long as access is denied, as long as the silence holds, the family controls what the house means. Or more accurately, they ensure it means nothing. It's just a building. Privately owned. Not open to the public. The end. No story. No interpretation. No context that might reveal something the family prefers to keep private. This is old money's ultimate strategy, not fighting to control the narrative, but removing the narrative entirely. You can't win a battle over interpretation if there's nothing to interpret. You can't be criticized for your choices if those choices remain invisible. You can't be judged by history if you've successfully removed yourself from history. The mansion was locked to keep people out. But more importantly, it was locked to keep a story in. And after nearly a century, that story is dying. The people who knew it are dead. The documents that might tell it are sealed or destroyed. The building that could reveal it is inaccessible. Within another generation, maybe two, no one will remember that the mansion was ever anything more than a locked Vanderbilt property. The questions will stop. The speculation will fade. And the family will have achieved what they set out to achieve when they locked the doors all those decades ago. Complete, utter, permanent silence. But here's what makes this story worth telling, even if we can never know its full truth. The locked mansion reveals more about power through what it hides than most monuments reveal, through what they display. Because grand public buildings, the ones that become museums and landmarks, tell a specific story. This family was important. This is how they lived. Admire what they built. But a locked mansion tells a different story. This family was important enough that they don't need to prove it. Private enough that they won't explain themselves. Powerful enough that their silence is respected. That's a kind of authority that most wealthy families never achieve. Not just the wealth to build something magnificent, but the confidence to lock it away. Not just the desire for privacy, but the power to make that privacy absolute. Not just the ability to withdraw from public life, but the social capital to do so without explanation or consequence. The mansion was locked forever because the family could afford to lock it forever. Financially, they had other properties, other resources. Socially, they had enough residual status that their withdrawal didn't diminish them. Legally, they had the infrastructure to maintain control across generations. And psychologically, they understood that sometimes the most powerful statement is refusing to make one. There's a concept in art called negative space, the empty areas around an object that define its shape. The locked mansion is negative space in American history. We can see its outline through what's missing. The absence of photographs, the lack of documentation, the silence where a story should be. And that absence tells us something about old money that presence never could. That true power doesn't need to be seen. It just needs to ensure that no one can see inside it. The Vanderbilt dynasty built monuments across America, mansions that still draw millions of visitors, that appear in documentaries, that define our understanding of Gilded Age excess. But this mansion, the one they locked and never explained, might be their most revealing monument of all. Not to what they wanted the world to see, but to what they needed the world to never see. And as it stands today, still locked, still silent, still impossible to access. It serves as a reminder that the most effective way to control history isn't writing it yourself. It's making sure certain chapters can never be read. The mansion that was quietly locked forever will outlast all the stories that could be told about it. Because stone endures longer than memory. And silence, when maintained with enough wealth and determination, can become permanent. One day, perhaps centuries from now, the family line will end, or the trust will dissolve, or the legal structures will finally collapse. And maybe then, the doors will open. Historians will enter. Photographs will be taken. The rooms will reveal whatever they've been hiding all these decades. Or maybe not. Maybe the mansion will be found empty, furniture gone, walls bare, nothing left but architecture. The story removed as systematically as the family's presence was. Either way, the silence will have served its purpose. Because by then, everyone who cared about why the mansion was locked will be long dead. The context will be lost. The significance will be impossible to reconstruct. And future historians will document yet another Vanderbilt mansion without understanding what made this one different. It wasn't built to be remembered. It was locked to be forgotten. And in the end, forgetting is exactly what happened. The house that once hosted senators and shaped social hierarchies exists now primarily as a question. What happened inside that required eternal silence? But that question, like the mansion itself, is slowly disappearing. Fewer people ask it each year. Fewer still persist when they hit the inevitable walls. And eventually, a question no one remembers to ask is the same as a question that was never asked at all. The Vanderbilts understood something that most families never learn. Legacy isn't about what you leave behind. It's about what you take with you when you go. And this mansion, locked for nearly a century, represents the ultimate old money legacy. A story so completely controlled that it ceased to exist as a story at all. Just a building. Still standing. Forever closed. And in its silence, more powerful than any monument that ever tried to speak.